Among the many teachers I've adopted for myself in my self-education was a man named Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell, he come to the reasoning that among the very many core reasons for the hero's journey was at the forefront the search for father. The search for father he thought of as the search that everybody naturally has, because it is where one finds their. And now I must say that his perspective was from a different time of universities, where he was mainly speaking to predominantly a number of male students, and his perspective may have been more centered towards the male attitude than it probably should have been. But anyhow, he thought that the search for father was at the forefront for the hero's journey. And in my learning of this, I came to determine that maybe even my adoption of all these teachers, so many Jerry Garcia, Woody Guthrie, Bob Dylan, was in perhaps a substitution for this connection that I never had with my own father. And there are times growing up I really wasn't too concerned about the whereabouts of him. He was gone before I was able to speak and ask the question where he was, and bits and pieces I'd hear here and there didn't really indicate to me a necessity for me to find him. I mean, I had my mother was an intelligent woman. Her father was an accomplished World War II veteran. So as far as, heroic role models to look up to, he was one of them. Then when it came time, I became more working age. I had an Uncle Steve who took me under his wing to a bit while he was running a funeral home, and taught me how to be tedious in my work and how to do thorough work, and the importance of having some integrity in my work ethic, and the importance of money and this and that. And he was quite accomplished in his own earnings of money. So as far as learning to be having potential paths to success laid out before me, I had that. So there really I didn't feel lacking of this role model that was missing from my father. But in time, I did it was really when it was about to be a father myself in 1998, moving into 1999, before the birth of my own son, that realizing that this was eclipsed all other events in my life up until this point. So I began to consider then what had distracted or detracted my father from the event of my own birth and my own life. And so the question came back to, in my mind, still leery about why, what sort of man would so diabolically leave out on such an event. And then as time passed, the internet came around. Now, I'd heard rumor once. My mom had said that my father had been in prison, and he was for bank robbery. And now, being a young boy at the time, pre-puberty, at the time hearing this, it was naturally something that was hard for me not to repeat to my chums, because everybody had they had their fathers to come to the ball games and whatnot, and offered me some sort of explanation, just as he came into conversation. And I told, and once in front of my mother, that my dad had been a bank robber and had been in prison. And she interrupted me and said, no, that was not the case. And I said, well, you're the one who told me. And she said, I just told you that. And so anyhow, but then the internet came around to where I had access to it. And this was in the early 2000s, very early 2000s. I had access to it at the library, but the time to have it in my own home and be able to sit down and divulge into it deeper and have more time to search things out, I come to find files that proof that he was in fact charged with bank robbery. And not only that, but at the age of 15 years old, he'd already had a felony charge against him involving firearms and armed burglary, along with his brothers. And I discussed this with my mother, and she's like, well, at the time you were a child, I thought that you talking about it could cause you more problems than it was going to present, than you needed to know about, and so I thought it was better that you didn't discuss it. And I understand that. My mom's interest was always 100% trying to look out for my own best interest, even if it involved withholding some knowledge from me for the time being. And so, that was proceeded on with that. But in looking at the documents closely, I saw that he had originally tried to defend himself against a possession of a firearm after his bank robbery thing, which involved a felony. You're not allowed to purchase a firearm, but it was, I do believe, without knowing the specifics of the case, he hadn't been convicted of the first charge at the time that the firearm was being purchased, so therefore he thought it was double jeopardy, to where he was already considered guilty of the one crime. So therefore, the second crime he hadn't been wasn't actually a crime yet, because he hadn't been convicted of the first. Well, all that being said, his own self-defense wasn't he wasn't successful in that, but a son of a very well-known Supreme Court justice, not U.S. Supreme Court, but get this sorted out when I look at the actual documents again, but well-known son of a well-known person in the legal field took his case up and fought it. And it mentions in this hearing that's of the document I had that there was 168 pages that he'd filed. Well, over time I came to think I really would like to have had access to that 168 pages. But in 2019, it was in 2018 that my mother passed away, and later in that same fall, my father passed away. And then it was in early 2020, I had a dream, and in this dream was Donald Rumsfeld, and he was pointing to a place in eastern Kentucky, and on the map it said Burton, and that was it, just that one thing, just Donald Rumsfeld pointing to the map said Burton, Kentucky. Now I wrote down the dream, and that was just a tidbit of the dream, but as a few months went by, I came to think, it was as the lockdown began with the COVID situation, that I looked up the Burton, Kentucky, to see if it really was a place, and there I found it and it was about maybe exactly at the spot where it had been pointed to by Donald Rumsfeld. So then I look at pull up all the information that I could find about it. Now my father's name, Sherman Dewey Burton, was a name that he didn't like, and because he didn't like it, he called himself Bob. And because he wanted me to also, as a son, to have that name rather than the name he'd inherited that he didn't want, he was okay for him. Him and my mother agreed that Robert would be a good name for me, because her father's name was Robert, who went by his middle name Frederick. And so giving me the first name Robert, the nickname Bob would be able to pay homage to both my grandfather on my mother's side and him on my father's side. So Bob, and thus as a child, Bobby became the name I went by. But it was the name. So I go back to where we left off in Kentucky. I look at what I can find there, and I find Dewey Lake, and I thought that interesting, because Dewey being my father's middle name. Well, then I search what I can find out about the name of that lake, Dewey, and I find it was named for Admiral Dewey. Well, in the course of my search of my genealogy, I also found one other document that took it back 2 generations further to a Rufus Burton, and Rufus being known to be a nickname, but it had not clear on it the reasoning behind Rufus, because sometimes it said that Rufus was used as a last name, sometimes as a first name, but always present in his name usage. And through understanding of this, I go back to Rufus and the time that he named my father's father was also Sherman Dewey Burton. So my father's name had trickled down from this man, Rufus Gollaher Burton, also known as William Rufus and Rufus Gollaher, these two names. So I look at that time period and I find that an Admiral Dewey at the time of 1900 was a very prominent figure in American news. And because of the Spanish-American War, and Admiral Dewey had been a successful leader in that war and perhaps the most prominent victor. Well, then with that knowledge, I think of the name Sherman, and going back a little further with Rufus Gollaher and his time and period of life. And then I think of General Sherman, who was a general and very prominent figure in the victory of the Civil War of the North over the South. So the same type of man who would be stand in admiration of an admiral, a victor in a war, would be the same type of man who would also want to pay homage to a general. So I deduced that Sherman Dewey Burton had been given as a name because of its paying homage to General Sherman and Admiral Dewey, which I do still believe valid. Now, the fact that this knowledge came to me through a dream reminds me of encrypted data, that data can be compressed into something very, very tiny, but when the file is expounded upon, great things can be found from it. Well, then searching farther into, the original document stated that they felt that the that Rufus had perhaps said that they had speculation over who his parents were. It was back in 2019 in that fall, during which time I was running Burton Studio and Gallery, a period where I didn't have electricity, and for my own entertainment in the darkness of the gallery at nighttime was I could charge up my computer through public electric for Christmas lights that was outside, and that would charge it up, and then we'd go to a place where there was access to the internet, and I would download longer podcasts and stuff like that. And in these, and also searching for my genealogical heritage, because I was not long after finding out about my father's death and finding out about gypsy heritage and these things that I've looked up on one of the podcasts happened to be a podcast called Brothers of the Serpent, and it was about Richard Francis Burton. And during the course of hearing his story, I found out that there was a missing period from his life that I believe the missing period was in 1860, and it was in the location there where roughly the whereabouts of where my family history began. And so over time, doing more studies with this and looking it up more, I'd actually heard of Sir Richard Francis Burton earlier, back in 1999 or 2000. I had watched a movie called Mountains of the Moon, which is also referenced in that same Brothers of the Serpent podcast. Now, at the time I watched it, I had no suggestion that it was related directly to me or had reason to feel that way, but then watching it again now, I see that movie's been changed a good bit. Some certain things have been left out on the copy I purchased through YouTube from what I originally watched. I remembered rather well. He was very good at drawing and things like that. And so I thought back, Sir, preceding his name means that he was knighted by Great Britain, and a man who's knighted cannot have illegitimate children attributed to him. And right before preceding his marriage with Isabel Burton, he came to the United States on this trip. Then it's in his biography that I have read about, the main source I've referenced in this biography that came out in 1991. It explains that there was a lot of mystery about this trip and a lot of things left out about it. And it seems so. I find that he came, before going to Floyd County, Kentucky, he visited a Floyd who was the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War it was called at the time. Now it says in the book that he went to the Secretary of War because he was interested in joining troops to fight the American Indians, which everything about his life up until that, with dealing with native peoples in India and Africa, is completely contrary to suggest that he would want to take in any way part in fighting the native peoples of a land, especially for a country that wasn't his part. So I think that this was in fact a cover-up for what his actual intentions were. And so visiting this Floyd, who was the Secretary of War, who would be Secretary of Defense, the same position held by Donald Rumsfeld, and being pointed to by Rumsfeld on a map of go there, I do believe was actually where he was directed by the Secretary of War at the time, John Floyd, to go, and was given a certain allotment of land to settle this family, as to amongst whom was a child who was either she was pregnant with or was very early in age. It suggested that my great-great-grandfather Rufus Richard Francis was born in 1858, and solves sort of why it would be a name that he never departed from. And thinking about how the document that I had that suggested, that let me know that he went by Rufus, looking at the way I was able to gather information, and the information I was able to gather is on documents, official documents. So it mentions that in the document that his sons worked for the railroad, and then it mentions his marriages. So I realized that what the documents they're looking at are his work records, during which time in his work records he went by William Rufus and Rufus Gollaher. Suggests to me that his name that he was given was probably William Gollaher, was officially the name he went by. So his mother's name was probably Gollaher, and which suggests she was of Irish descent. And so, but at the time he switches, the Burton comes into it, would be at the time of marriage, where he wanted to make sure that that was the name he passed on to his children, and he successfully did so, and means that he was adequately able to convince, so said authorities, that he was in fact a Burton. And I do believe that I am a direct descendant from great-great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, Sir Richard Francis Burton. Thank you.